Welcome to the Public Voice Salon. We are an open dialogue on education, the arts, and social change. And today we're going to have a dialogue with Yetta Goodman, who is a leading expert on whole language. She is a professor emeritus at the University of Arizona, long been active in education. She's a leading speaker around the world in conferences that has to do with language and literacy and psychology, and she brings that all together. And with her wisdom, we're so grateful to have her on our show today. Thank you, Dr. Goodman, for joining us.
It's my pleasure, and please feel free to use the word Yetta. I don't mind.
Okay. Oh, that's wonderful, Yetta. Okay. So Yetta, let's begin with this notion of whole language. A lot of people maybe haven't heard that term. It was very popular in the 1980s, right? When it first came out, it began in California with this California Writing Project. And then somehow I think it was the conservatives attacked it or something. I don't know exactly what happened. I know your husband, Ken, was very active with it and you were active with it. Maybe you could just try to give a simple definition to our audience, what whole language is.
Well, those of us who believed in whole language originally, actually, I have to say to you, you probably will be surprised at this, but the word whole language came here from Canada to the United States, from one of the Canadian provinces. And when I come to specific names, I'm going to forget them. But one of the middle provinces in Canada, they were using the word whole language before we got hold of it. And eventually, as whole language began to be used by so many different people in different ways, Ken began to feel uncomfortable with that term. So he didn't use it as much later on. But originally, basically, whole language meant that we look at language, reading, writing, speaking, and listening. All four, reading and writing, are not separate. And I actually am reading, I just found this book. I'm very interested in the brain, and I'm not a great scholar of the brain. And so here's a new book. It's called A User's Guide to the Brain by John J. Ratey, R-A-T-E-Y. And he was a medical doctor. And this is called The User's Guide to the Brain. Mm. And I've read about 5 books now about the brain, and I still feel uncomfortable about it because I don't understand the really technical issues that are so important to the brain. Mm. But of course, language takes place in our brains. Mm. And some people say you are who you speak, you are who you read, you are who you write, you are who you listen. And language is all 4 of those things now, especially. And as soon as humans began to move around almost 5,000 years ago, reading and writing began supposedly about that time. But and as people developed the need for interacting with people who were not close, reading and writing became the concept. But yet in schools, we still have a tendency to break language into pieces. Mm. And I don't know when we'll get away from that. All of a sudden, we had this science of reading issue that came out. And I really don't want to talk much about that, if that's okay with you.
That's fine with us. Yeah, okay.
Because I just have great difficulty with that. But at the same time, the brain people, like this Dr. Ratey, R-A-T-E-Y, the biggest problem there is they haven't read much about our work. Mm. They haven't read much about the people who are actually working with kids in classrooms. So they still have a lot of questions about how people get engaged in writing. And for us, And that's where the whole language comes in, the term whole language. We want to look at language as a single experience, not that reading and writing it is just oral language written down.
Mm.
Reading and writing has its own properties as language. And that's generally how I would put it. And I don't know if you've had questions, I could answer more, but that's about where I am.
Wonderful. Wow. This is a dialogue that's, I think, necessary for the country to see right now because, we're talking about the link between education and democracy, which is more obvious than ever before. And in particular, we find in our show, my wife and I, our goal of our show is really to really popularize this link between education and democracy, which unfortunately is not being talked about on the major television shows. They really don't. I think that, one reason we created this show, Yetta, is because when I became a teacher, I began to see the lack of intelligent discourse on education on television, right? I mean, Barack Obama once said, if it's not on TV, it doesn't exist. Well, guess what, folks? Education doesn't exist because we're not on TV, But so someone like you, Yetta, I mean, you're like the closest thing we have in our field to a superstar. I mean, you go around and you talk at conferences and whatever. That's great. But, until people like you are as famous as Kim Kardashian, I don't think we're going to have much hope for transforming our society. What do you think about that? What do you think about how education is presented in the media?
Well, what's sad is what I just read, what I just said about the book. Here's a book that I'm really excited about reading because it's teaching me where the brain people are now. And they're very aware that the brain operates in a very complex, interactive way. And that some people are saying we are our brains, which is an interesting concept to think about. And so that's where I am. I believe we are our brains. But that means that the brains don't necessarily initially have to deal with letters or have to deal with sounds or have to deal with words. And I wish we didn't have the word for words because we've gotten so focused so that kids go around with a package of words on a ring and they're reading words, but words make no sense out of context. And we have the same words in English, and each written language is different. But in English, we can have the same words that sound differently, just put them in another context. And, that's a good thing to have teachers begin to think about. How do you know what the sound of that word is? Because you know what the language is saying and what it means. And that's why our focus, and little kids are doing this themselves. And that's the other piece that I'd like to talk about a little bit or just suggest.
Yeah.
I have spent my time using what my husband developed called Miscue analysis, where I look at kids' language and look at how they make miscues. And Ken decided he didn't like the word miscues, but I don't have another name for it yet. But a miscue is simply the parts of language that you read different. And everybody miscues. I love to follow my own miscues when I'm reading the daily newspaper. And I realize, and I just remembered this, I don't remember the miscue itself, but I remember just 2 days ago, I read a whole article. I got to the last line of the newspaper and looked at that and realized that I made a miscue at the very first sentence. And our brains want us to make sense. So we use our own knowledge to read and to write and to speak and to listen.
Mm.
And that's why we need to keep language whole. And that's going back to the whole language again, and not begin to sound things out and treat language as if you can divide it into words. You can't divide language into words. It's not just words. And everybody knows it when you think about it.
Mm. Well, wow, this is wonderful. Again, it is such an honor to meet you, Yetta. I mean, you're one of those names that it's like sanctified in our field, quoted so many times in doctoral theses, and it's like to get to meet one's hero. This is fabulous. Just to contextualize it, I come out of the NYU School of English Education in the mid 1990s, which was considered at the time to be very forward thinking, right? And one of the best programs of its kind, actually. And so that's where I first learned about whole language. And my professor, John Mayer, wrote on the board, reading, writing, talking, listening, right? So
Right.
I got the four modes right there, okay? And then immediately they put the chairs in a circle, okay? I had never taught I've never experienced a classroom in a circle before that in my life. And now I'm teaching currently. I teach at Stevens Institute of Technology in Hoboken, and I'm in the English language communication department. I'm teaching students from India and China, and I put them in a circle, and it's the first time they ever sat in a circle before. And so that also is an experience of democracy, because I was taught about the architecture of democracy and how that relates to whole language. So I say this to you now in the context yet of a country and a world in which autocracy is rising. And it just seems to me that we're missing the boat in terms of the connection between whole language and democracy. And what can we do to repair that?
Well, I don't know. There's some, I can't answer that question easily.
Yeah.
It's what you believe in your own brain about how things work in the world. And I spent my early years, one of my earliest memories of thinking about language was when I was my oldest daughter, Debbie, who just retired from Hofstra University, by the way, in New York.
Mm.
And she lives in Massachusetts now.
Mm.
But Debbie was on the floor, and she was playing on the floor, and I was laying there watching her. And I had Ralph's Market. All of you who know California must know Ralph's Market, and then maybe there are other Ralph's Markets elsewhere. I don't know, but this was California, and I had Ralph's Market open because I was going to go shopping. And Debbie's, crawling around and picking up her toys, and she's just getting up. And she's just about 2.5, and she comes over to me and she looks at me, and she was still not talking well, but she was talking about her toys. And then she said to me, "Oh my goodness." And I said, "What's wrong?" "Ralph's." And she points to the Ralph's logo on the top of the two sheets that I'm reading. Mm-hmm. And she points directly to Ralph's. That's the first time. And I began I think I was the first Miscue dissertation that was ever done. And I did Debbie's work, because as soon as she said that, I said, "Oh, Debbie, come on, let's go to the refrigerator. I want you to show me something." And we went to the refrigerator. She was just hobbling at that time. I opened the refrigerator and I said, "Where do you see Ralph's?" She pointed to the sour cream. She pointed to the milk. She pointed to everything in there that had Ralph's in there. Language, written language, is part, in the same way that oral language is part of everything, written language is part of everything. I'm convinced that many, many young kids, how many people that are listening to this know that when they drive by a hamburger place, the kids either say hamburger or they'll say the name of the company that makes the hamburger.
Mm.
And that goes, and signs in our environment are so powerful.
Hmm.
And we don't know that the kids are learning these on their own because we're not consciously aware of it. And then we think it's cute, but it's not cute. It's part of how language is developed for all of us and how we begin to realize that oral language and written language have counterparts and how they work.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this also comes out of the work of Lev Vygotsky, the great Russian psychologist who talked about
Absolutely.
the importance of social life and how language and social life very sort of overlap and intersect, and also the work of Frank Smith, the famous psycholinguist, right, who I think it was actually Frank Smith and Ken who are now credited with creating whole language. But you were right there, I'm sure, in these rooms too, Yetta. So what about the work of people like Smith and
Well, um, I'm writing, don't tell it too many people, but I'm writing a book of my life, and calling it an academic love affair.
Mm,
And of course, that's me and Ken,
oh,
and um, and Frank Smith and Ken got to know each other
huh,
many, many years ago. And I was trying to figure out the date, but it's really decades ago because Frank's been gone for some time already. And Ken, and that's where we met Frank when he was presenting at an International Reading Association meeting in California. And Ken was speaking and Frank was speaking. And they just met that day. And so Frank came over and said, Ken, we've got to have lunch together. And the three of us, went and had lunch together. And Frank and Ken just became so
huh,
engaged with each other at that moment. I was sitting there. It was wonderful to listen to them. And
huh.
they got so excited about each other. Frank went home, and we went home. And about 2 weeks later, Ken had an article written by Frank, and it was the first article that Frank and Ken did
Ah,
together. And I can't remember the name of it right now. I can't remember the year, but
mm,
it goes back a long way because, anyway. So that was the beginning for us. But um, over the years, we've built relationships with our doctoral students. We've built relationships with school boards and school districts. Ken and I have had the great pleasure of being in so many countries where people are so eager
mm,
to have the same kind of knowledge and understand.
huh.
And where we go, it works. And it works until somebody finds ways of destroying it. And as you say, it's still happening today.
And is that, I wonder how politically motivated that is, right?
Well, it's got to be very politically motivated because every inner city is considered to be a ghetto.
Mm,
And of course, the fact that ghetto is really a Jewish term and an Italian term and not an inner city English term is an important thing to think about.
mm,
And ghetto has always been used to be the term for a place where people are placed to be kept apart from other people, because the first ghetto was in Italy, and that was for Jews that were displaced from Spain.
mm,
And so that, so that term ghetto is a very powerful one for me, because when Ken and I moved, we got married in Los Angeles. We moved to Detroit, where Ken got one of his first jobs at the university. He already had his doctorate from UCLA, California. And we got there, and um, the in Detroit. And here we went and we lived in a community in Detroit that was set apart to be integrated. The African Americans, all the other areas, Catholic Church, Protestants, Jews, immigrants from different countries. We all decided we wanted an area where we could live that we would remain integrated. It wouldn't turn all to being poor people or all Black people, but it would remain integrated. And it was integrated in, talking about the political stuff that you were talking about. It was integrated for numbers of years. There was a congressman that just left the Senate and moved back to that same community just now. He just left recently, and my names are not my great forte these days. But so that the political issues are very powerful. And of course, Ken did a lot of research, and I was part of the whole thing, where we looked at 8 different populations of communities with different dialects, Spanish and English, and other dialects besides that as well. And we worked in Maine. We picked up elementary. We did it in elementary too. I think we went to about junior high. And all of them had a dialect, and all of them made the same kinds of miscues, not the exact same miscues. And to me, as a miscue is what you say when you say something that makes sense to you that isn't written on the paper. But it does make sense to you. Miscues are not, unfortunately for the miss, they're just the cues. And the cues are what tells us, but our cues are also in our head. So if we are enjoying our reading, we just keep using our cues, and sometimes we change the language of the text because it makes sense in our dialect, in our history with language and stuff like that. I'm not sure that I'm going to stop because I want you to ask questions.
Okay. What's wonderful about our field, there's a lot of stuff that needs to be known. And in terms of, people who are in the field would find very rich and meaningful, but some people outside the field might be like a little confused by the jargon or whatever. But I would like to say that the field of language education, in particular English education, what happens in these classrooms has a direct impact on the state of our democracy, because it's how young people are socialized into using language, and whether they're able to express themselves freely, whether they're able to have dialogues with each other, be able to think critically, coming out of these classrooms into the world. We have a very important job. I want to mention a conference you were in, a very important conference, Yetta, in 2001. It was like a week or so after 9/11, and it took place at Hofstra University, and it was a gathering of women scholars, a very famous gathering. And in fact, a book came out of that, which I have on my bookshelf. And I dip into it from time to time. And it was with you, Maxine Green, Louise Rosenblatt, and a few other people. What were your memories of that conference, and why was that so important?
That's one of my favorite conferences I've ever participated in. And I was the baby of the group. I was in my 70s. I'm now 93.
Oh,
so I just want you to know that. And the thing that I've come to realize as I'm beginning to write the book that I'm working on is that I never realized I was so much older than my graduate students. I just thought I was part of that community, and I keep thinking about that. But we've been fighting these same issues. We've been concerned about the same issues since I started teaching in 1952.
Mm. Hmm.
And even at that time, there were people like Ken and me. We weren't the first ones. We were both, Ken was working in, both of us had jobs in California. Um, um, that was the worst decade in my life, the 1950s, if you
Mm.
want to be political.
Mm.
Because in the 1950s, the person who was also very famous at the time was some guy by the name of McCarthy. And anyway, so he was a disaster. He caused a whole political movement to happen because people began to fire teachers. About, I think I heard, and I please know that I'm not sure of this, but I think I heard once that 1,800 teachers were fired from the state, from Los Angeles, California in the 1950s by McCarthy, and they were labeled as communists, whether they agreed to that or not. So if you're talking about political stuff,
Mm.
uh, this has been going on in our history forever. And I'm sure it goes back previously, even when you go back to the people like the people in the 1700s that were working on trying to get people to recognize language as a holistic experience, as meaning passed orally, as meaning passed from writing experiences. And so to not think of politics in relationship to language is impossible.
Wow. Yeah. And if you look at the work of Henry Giroux on this is very important. The work of Noam Chomsky on this is also very important because
Absolutely.
I believe that there was a connection between Chomsky and whole language. Is that true?
Well, Chomsky was very, Chomsky's still alive here in
Yes.
Arizona.
Yes.
So, and he's still, I don't know if he's writing anymore, but he's still, the last time I saw him, he was doing quite well. And, but he helped us think about the fact that you can't think about language without thinking about society.
Mm.
Humans are who we are because of language.
Mm.
And no matter how much we know that there are animals that can seem to understand things and stuff like that, there's been no evidence that people can have conversations and and not only to speak, but to read and write. And there's still people to this day that want to separate reading and writing from oral language.
Mm. Mm.
And they are, and that's the power of the word whole language, is we've got to keep an idea, our eyes on the fact
Mm.
that written forms are the way we're able to communicate long distance.
Mm.
So right now, you and I can communicate in person, but I'm seeing what I'm saying right in front of me down here. So if I make a mistake or a miscue while I'm talking about coming out of my head, I can, oh, and here I can look at miscue is spelled Misquue. Misqueque. That's what the written form looks like.
Yeah, wow. And I think also, Yetta, this also goes with this whole idea that it's okay to make a mistake, that there's a playfulness to language growth and development. It's like kids playing in the sandbox. And I think that's true at any age, really, to be liberated, to be able to have that playful spirit with language, but in particular, that it should be meaningful, like you said. And too often in our English classrooms and our language classrooms, they're so disconnected. There's like the textbook, and then there's the drill and the fill in the blanks, and there's going to be a test on Monday, and anything but meaning, right? Anything but meaning. And I think whole language was meant to really address that deficiency of meaning, because if it's not meaningful, why bother doing it, if it's not meaningful? And I think so I celebrate you, I celebrate Ken, I celebrate the whole language movement, what it was, what it still is. I think it's in remission right now, and I think it ought to be revived and brought back, because I think it's waiting to be brought back. I really do believe we'd like to champion that, because as an English professor myself, I never use a textbook. Okay, I'm very improvisational, and I try to use this whole language, idea of you and Ken and people like Frank Smith, and it seems to work.
Yeah, and I don't I absolutely what you said is so important. And I was trying to find I have a granddaughter who just and I she's just she just writes all kinds of things, and I thought I had it closer by, but it's not, and I don't want to spend that time. But it's just amazing to watch her write, because she writes what she hears. And she wrote me a letter, and that's what I was looking for. And she spells announcement. And she goes ANOUNCE MENT. And I just was so shocked to see that. She's 7 years old. And the whole letter is meaningful, and every word has misspellings of some sort in it, but I absolutely can read the whole thing.
Wow.
And those are things that we can see every day in our own homes. We have to help parents be aware that that's the other big question, is how we get to parents and help parents be aware that they don't have to stand over kids and give them, and help teachers not have kids walking around with a ring and a whole bunch of letters and sounds and words on a ring. Use books. Our country is rich with children's literature. Sit down with your kids and read a real book by one of these great authors that we have out there. And it's an exciting place. Librarians are so helpful. So as far as parents are concerned, if those of you who are interested in listening, the librarians are terrific about helping children read real books. And that's what we have to move away from readers. And the problem is, of course, people are making billions of dollars when they sell reading series. We don't need reading series that are made up by people who aren't authors.
Or not educators.
Or educators. And what I'm interested in now is that the brain people are exploring all this. The people who are brain psychologists and brain people who work in various different fields, and they're so smart, but they still sometimes don't know that written language is oral language. I mean, that language is language in different forms.
Wow, Yetta, this precious hour with you was flying by too quickly. But before we go any further, I would just love to give you a chance to talk about your own biography a little bit. Growing up, where you grew up, what were some influences on you in terms of developing your personality to become a teacher, to become someone so interested with language, and in terms of parents, teachers, community. What were some of your seminal influences?
Well, I grew up in a Yiddish-speaking home. My parents were immigrants from the Ukraine, not from Russia. And the reason I said Russia first is for some reason, my parents never used the word Ukrainian. They always used the word Russisch, which is Russian in Yiddish. And so, and I don't quite know why. And that I never figured out. And it's not until recently, and I'm not, my parents are gone now. But so that's an important beginning for me, is that I have my history back to the Ukraine. And then my parents came to America, and my mother passed away not too long after that. So but I was 19 already when my mother passed away. So I was an adult already. And my sister, it was 9 years older than I was. And my father was a junk peddler. He wasn't a salvage dealer. He was a junk peddler, originally with horses and wagons. I don't remember him with that, but I do remember other peddlers who used to put their vehicles in our backyard overnight, over weekends, because they lived in other houses, and they just left their horses and wagons in our backyard. We had a little place for that. And my dad was one of these people, and my parents both spoke Yiddish at home all the time. My mother went to night school, and it was on and off, on and off. So she never really, but she became good in English. She never really, and she could understand everything. My dad, forget it. He just, he was busy, with his junk stuff and things like that. And I grew up in that home. I was Yiddish speaking until I was 5. I went to kindergarten. My sister was older than me by 9 years. And so English, I heard English from her, but both of our parents spoke Yiddish all the time. So until I got to kindergarten, although I was familiar with English, I didn't speak much English. And kindergarten, one semester, I'm speaking English. Less than one semester, actually. It was about 6 weeks, because the kindergarten teacher was so impressed that I learned English so well. And I'm sure my sister had her impact on that, because she used to take me to the library once a week. And we got 3 books from the library, and I was reading when I was 8 years old, books from the library. And the library used to have, in the summertime, if you read 10 books, you get certificates. And I still have my 8 years of certificates. They're just special to me, because I was an immigrant child. I was no doubt poor, inner city, living among Black folks and immigrants, all coming from Europe, and immigrants coming from Asia. They were right there. That was my upbringing. And now I go and I still hear people talk about inner cities as if everybody's stupid. Nobody knows what they're doing. And we've just got to, how we help our teachers to get away from those views. That's what I'm concerned about.
Wow. Yeah, if you could give a piece of advice to the Secretary of Education, what would you say in terms of what needs to be done in our educational system to transform it, to make it functioning in terms of living up to its promise of strengthening our democracy?
I think teachers need to be well educated, and they are. The teachers who are in Tucson, Arizona, have all of them receive at least a bachelor's degree, and most of them get masters before. We have to look at the curriculum and encourage linguists and other people who deal with language variation to work together with education. The brain people need to find out who the educators are and begin to give them some kind of respect. Because without understanding how teaching in the school influence what happens to kids, then we have no real opportunity to let the world know our kids are learning. Stop attacking our schools.
Yeah.
You know, our teachers are getting master's degrees all over the country, I think, as far as I know. But if in Arizona it's happening, it should be happening in lots of other places as well.
And what about the role, let's say, of the humanities? We try to use our TV show as a platform to really champion the humanities. One of our guests that on our show was Harold Bloom, the notable literary critic, and he basically said that without the humanities, you basically open the door to fascism. That the humanities is a bulwark for preserving our democracy, in particular literature. And he said something to us that was on the pessimistic side. He actually said that, he said that the war to save literature is over, and that all we can do is gather a saving remnant. And so I thought to myself, if that's true, I wonder if education is not killing literature by not using the whole language approach, right? By turning it into a chore where everything is about testing and drilling and decontextualized nonsense, and rather than meaning. How are we educating a generation of readers or people who will naturally want to read books and love literature? I think schools are doing just the opposite. Am I being too controversial in saying that?
I think you're being too pessimistic.
Okay. I hope you're right. I hope you're right. Okay.
Because when I think about the people that I know that are in colleges of education, in humanities programs, in linguistics programs, they're all useful and helpful. How we work together is difficult because it just depends on the university and the community. But yet we, I'm always so upset about whenever school starts, all we hear about is these inner city kids that can't read and can't write, and it's just not true. They speak in a dialect, and that's of course what Ken worked so hard to help people understand. That dialect variation happens across our country. We have so many different dialects in the United States, especially when you include Hawaii is in the United States. And Ken, we did do studies with Hawaiian kids. We studied with kids all over. And everywhere you have kids, yes, kids are struggling, and yes, kids need help, but usually the help has to be positive, supportive, not punitive. And this is something, as far as I know, I don't know educators, my colleagues are positive people and supportive of all kinds of positive things. And yet we still act as if inner city kids, can't do anything. And as I said, when Ken and I grew up, we lived in Detroit for a long time. And it was wonderful to live in a community where people spoke, I don't know, maybe a dozen dialects in one community in Detroit.
Wow. This is like, for me, a dream come true to talk to you, Yetta, because I consider myself a major education nerd. Can I say that? Education nerd. And I just love to get granular and into the theory and the policy, possibilities. I would love to see you get on one of the big shows, like Rachel Maddow or one of the major CNN or MSNBC, which they really need to, I think they need to start hiring education pundits and cultural pundits. I think we're sort of saturated with the whole legal and business and political stuff. When you watch these shows, it almost seems like that's the only reality in our country is politics and and law, you know, but here we have an articulate woman like yourself. As we move towards closure, I just want to throw a couple of quick names out there. Nell Noddings is somebody who was a guest star on our show and was a friend of ours also, and she talked about education for caring. And it seems like your approach definitely advocates for more caring, you know, by creating sort of a meaningful classrooms. And also Diane Ravitch was a guest on our show. And Diane Ravitch, you know, arguably is one of the leading educational scholars and historians. She's very critical of the schools today and how they're set up in terms of the attack against whole language, you know. You know, so what do you think about that, about the work of Ravitch? Yeah.
You know, I just don't know how to say it enough times that the language is a powerful is powerful for each of us. And as a teacher, I can go back to, I told you, 1940s. But the issue comes when we minimize the power of people who are educating. We've got to work with the people who are there. And we've got to, you don't come in with new things all the time. I mean, the science of reading is so disastrous. And I want to say that as strongly as I can. And I have to say, you might be very interested in this. The woman who wrote the first book actually came and interviewed Ken and me 2 years before she published the book. Now, I don't know where that came from, but she was so excited to want to talk to us. And she just left. And then 2 years later, here's this book that deals with languages as if it doesn't exist. Because, and so that's what's so sad about this, because we have so many years with all the people that you've mentioned who have helped us see that the power of language. And that's what we have to try to help teachers work with. Parents need to be helped with this. That the best thing that they can do is read to their kids. The best thing they can do is let the kids read with them. And then they'll discover that their kid is reading. That's such an exciting thing to do. And the people in colleges of education have to reach out to parents and not, see, we separate ourselves, colleges of education, humanities communities, everything is separate. How do we work with each other? I don't know. It's very complicated. And you may have a better response than I would.
Well, oh, that's wonderful. And you know, you are such an inspiration for Claudia and I as well. My darling wife, Claudia, who's right here. There's Claudia, my co-producer, and without whose love, this show would not exist. I like to talk about the power of love. You know, people like Bell Hooks have written about love. Paulo Freire used to say we need to teach for a world in which it's easier to love. It's obvious the love between you and Ken was central to this whole project. Could you say a little bit about that, maybe about your love for Ken and, you know, how that also was part of this whole chemistry of teaching?
Well, all I could think about is all the people that that have influenced me, and I have to go back to, and right now, why am I, the name is just, who's the greatest educator in the United States?
John Dewey. John Dewey.
John Dewey. And he lived with Ken and me all the time. And of course, I didn't know him. I never met him.
Yes.
But he was such an influence for us. The three women that you talked about, what an impact they had on the Hofstra community. And my daughter Debbie actually taught at Hofstra for a while. And the person who teaches there now is still doing Miscue analysis with his students. So you might want to get a hold of person who does the classes in miscue analysis at Hofstra.
Or if you could put a good word in with your daughter Debbie, we'd love to have her on the show as well.
Oh, sure. That'd be fine. Oh, I think she'll come. I mean, she's in New York. You can,
Oh,
I mean, she's in Massachusetts now. She was at Hofstra, but she's in Massachusetts.
close enough.
Just
Close enough. We could take a train there very easily from New York. We're in the New York area.
I'm glad to send you her address.
Oh boy. As we wrap up here, we have about how long, Claudia? 2 minutes? We have 3 minutes left. So let's just sort of move towards closure. Any final reflections, Yetta, on this dialogue? Any questions you might have for us? Let's just sort of ease out in a very authentic way.
Well, the only thing I worry about is that we still think, even as we have the people who are now talking about the brain, the complexity of the brain, we still have a sense that somehow there are some kids who can't do it. I've never met a kid in my life who can't learn to read.
Mm.
I don't know what else to say. And I've spent my life trying to say that.
Mm.
It takes time for some kids because they have different perspectives. There are kids who prefer to live outside and play more. Sure. But as far as getting engaged, I don't have a grandson or great grandchild or anybody in my family that isn't some kind of a reader. And so, and it's not because we know more about reading, it's just that we just involved everybody in all the reading experiences that everybody was having. It just happens, and writing as well. The spelling that kids do when they're young, if people can watch that, if teachers would look at the spellings and see how kids use the sounds of language in order to write their misspelled, and they're not misspelled because you can read them.
Well, thank you so much, Yetta, for spending this delightful hour with us. And it's been such a joy and pleasure to interact with you, to dialogue with you. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the leading educational thinkers of our time, Yetta Goodman, Dr. Goodman and her husband, Ken, were pioneers of whole language, which is a very interesting type of pedagogy which connects democracy with education and uses, really some of the best ideas in education, and we hope that will go on. Our conversation will go on because I enjoy so much talking to you, Yetta, on the air, off the air. Keep up the wonderful work. Good luck in your new book, and we're so blessed to have your ideas, your positive thinking about education, your enthusiasm, and all that. And we really care about you, and so thank you so much for being with us today.
And thank you so much for involving me. I appreciate it a lot.
Okay. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Take care.